My friends, thank you for coming. I'm so glad you're here. I need someone to talk to. I can't sleep. It started with this one dream. There were all these doctors and nurses huddled around a gurney, but the doctors and nurses were gagged, and they had their hands tied behind their backs. Then I realized I was at an autopsy, because on the gurney was the dead body of the president, President Carter. And all around the room were these generals and admirals and FBI agents. The president sat up on the table. He looked me right in the eye.
America at the moment does not have a functioning democracy.
There was another man in the shadows. I couldn't see his face, but his voice was clear.
The murder of the president is not a mystery.
But President Carter isn't murdered.
Any citizen who is willing to look can see clearly who killed President Kennedy.
When I looked back at the table, I saw it wasn't Carter. It was President Kennedy, and the back of his head was gone. Standing behind him was a black man. He reminded me of Martin Luther King. He reached out his hand and said,
"The question now is, what will you do with that?"
I can't shake this dream. I need to sort it out, but I don't know who to trust. I barely trust anyone anymore. Where did it start? I tried to trust Obama, but he's not doing what he said he'd do.
Which leads to the question, why would he do all these things? Why would he be afraid, for example, to take the drones away from the CIA? Well, I've come to the conclusion that he is afraid.
Who the hell are you?
That's 27-year CIA veteran analyst Ray McGovern, the man who used to personally deliver the CIA's presidential daily briefings to George Bush Sr.
Really? Or am I still dreaming?
Everything you're about to hear that isn't a narration is a quote made by the character speaking, or relayed by someone who was there when the character was speaking. Statements have been edited or reordered to help tell the story.
And I know from a good friend who was at a dinner party with progressive supporters that they asked him, "Why don't you do the things we thought you stood for?" Obama turned sharply and said, "Don't you remember what happened to Martin Luther King?"
He said that?
That's a quote. So I'm pretty convinced the president is afraid of the CIA. He's got 2 small kids and he doesn't want to get killed.
Oh, come on. He's president of the United States.
The mystery of President Kennedy's assassination has not been solved in the mainstream press. You need to read James Douglas's book, JFK and the Unspeakable, and then you need to reflect on Obama.
Now, wait a minute. I'm not a conspiracy theorist.
A witness of a crime who just stands by tends by that very fact to become an accomplice.
That's Thomas Merton, Trappist monk and author.
How am I an accomplice to the Kennedy assassination?
Here's feminist Gloria Steinem.
The truth will set you free, but first, it'll piss you off.
Nobody is going to force me to do anything I don't think is in the best interest of the country.
That little Kennedy, he thought he was a god.
President John F. Kennedy and Allen Dulles, director of the CIA.
Okay, so it was the Cold War. We had the CIA with Dulles in charge, and he's going to go against President Kennedy?
Right. Before John Kennedy became president, Dulles and the CIA had plans to invade Cuba and get rid of President Fidel Castro.
Have you ever heard of the Bay of Pigs?
Sort of.
Well, the CIA and military were working with CIA-trained Cuban exiles, people who had left Cuba when Castro came to power, and they planned to attack Cuba. When Kennedy came into office, he nixed the plan and said U.S. troops would not invade. So then the CIA and military gave him a plan to just have the CIA-trained exiles land in Cuba at a place called the Bay of Pigs. Journalist Daniel Shore.
The assumption was that President Kennedy would be forced by public opinion to come to the aid of the Cuban patriots. American forces, probably Marines, would come in.
Did the CIA and military's plan work? Did Kennedy send in troops?
They couldn't believe that a new president like me wouldn't panic and try to save his own face. Well, they had me figured all wrong.
In effect, President Kennedy was the target of a CIA covert operation that collapsed when the invasion collapsed.
But Kennedy was a cold warrior, right? Everybody was just keeping America safe. And what's this got to do with his assassination?
Well, after the investigation into what happened at the Bay of Pigs, President Kennedy fired Allen Dulles and his 2 senior deputies and cut the CIA's budget.
I want to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds.
Kennedy said that?
Kennedy also moved responsibility for covert operations, like the Bay of Pigs, to the Department of Defense, which he thought he could control better.
But the military's Joint Chiefs of Staff carried on the CIA vision. They came up with Operation Northwoods, another plan to deal with Cuba. James Bamford, author and journalist.
Operation Northwoods called for innocent people to be shot on American streets, for boats carrying refugees fleeing Cuba to be sunk on the high seas, for a wave of violent terrorism to be launched in Washington, D.C., Miami, and elsewhere. People would be framed for bombings they did not commit, and planes would be hijacked.
The Joint Chiefs of Staff?
Here's Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Lyman Lemnitzer.
Such a plan would enable a buildup of incidents to camouflage the ultimate objective, overt military intervention.
The 1975 U.S. Senate Committee, the Church Committee, investigating foreign operations, reported,
Non-attribution to the United States for covert operations was the original and principal purpose of the so-called doctrine of plausible denial. But failing to call dirty business by its rightful name may have increased the risk of dirty business being done.
Here's Thomas Merton from his book, Raids on the Unspeakable.
The unspeakable is the void that contradicts everything that is spoken, even before the words are said. The void that gets into the language of public and official declarations at the very moment when they are pronounced, and makes them ring dead with the hollowness of the abyss.
In October 1962, the U.S. and the USSR confronted each other over the Soviet installation of nuclear-armed missiles in Cuba. Kennedy's military advisors pressed for an invasion of Cuba, but President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the USSR, had begun a secret correspondence in 1961 aimed at averting a nuclear catastrophe. Their back-channel negotiations averted the Cuban Missile Crisis.
But the pressure on Kennedy continued. Kennedy's Joint Chiefs pushed the president to pursue the Cold War in Latin America. Here's President Kennedy.
We can't embrace every tin-horn dictator who tells us he's anti-communist while he's standing on the necks of his own people. And the United States government is not the representative of private business. Do you know in Chile, the American copper companies control about 80% of all foreign exchange? We wouldn't stand for that here, and there's no reason they should stand for it. There's a revolution going on down there, and I want to be on the right side of it. Hell, we are on the right side, but we have to let them know it, that things have changed.
Whoa.
And in Southeast Asia, Admiral Arleigh Burke, Army General George Decker, General Lyman Lemnitzer, and JFK.
We have to be prepared somewhere in Southeast Asia to throw in enough to win the works.
If we go in, we should go in to win, and that means bombing Hanoi, China, maybe even using nuclear weapons.
If we are given the right to use nuclear weapons, we can guarantee victory.
These people are crazy. General MacArthur said the chickens are coming home to roost from the Eisenhower years, and I live in the chicken coop.
In Vietnam, they suggested a nuclear strike and kept pushing for combat troops.
And what about that CIA plot to assassinate their president?
Right, President Diem of South Vietnam. Here JFK said,
I've got to do something about those CIA bastards.
He did. What did he do?
in October of 1963, he issued the National Security Action Memorandum number 263, authorizing
the withdrawal from Vietnam of 1,000 U.S. military personnel by the end of 1963, and by the end of 1965, the bulk of U.S. personnel.
So, if JFK had lived, there wouldn't have been a Vietnam War? That's 50,000 American lives lost.
58,000 American lives and 3 million Vietnamese lives.
A month before going to Dallas, President Kennedy decided to create his own back channel to communicate with Fidel Castro, just as he had done with Nikita Khrushchev. Fidel Castro met with President Kennedy's envoy on November 20th, 1963. Here's Castro.
Kennedy still has the possibility of becoming, in the eyes of history, the greatest president of the United States, the leader who may at last understand that there can be coexistence between capitalists and socialists, even in the Americas. He would then be an even greater president than Lincoln. I know that for Khrushchev, Kennedy is a man you can talk with.
The next day, November 21st, Kennedy boarded Air Force One for Texas and Dallas.
A year after his forces came to power in Cuba, Castro and his delegation came to New York to attend the United Nations for the very first time. Here's historian Joy James.
The U.S. State Department pressured the Shelburne Hotel on Lexington Avenue to cancel its contract for accommodations to the Cuban delegation.
And here's Fidel.
We faced two alternatives. One was the United Nations Gardens. When I mentioned this to the Secretary General, he was horrified at the thought of a delegation in tents. But when we received Malcolm X's offer, I said, that's the place, the Hotel Teresa. I always recall my meeting with Malcolm X because he was the one who supported us and made it possible for us to stay there.
And Malcolm X.
The Black Revolution is sweeping Asia, is sweeping Africa, is rearing its head in Latin America. The Cuban Revolution, that's a revolution. They overturned the system.
And Martin Luther King Jr. was saying,
the nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward gaining political independence, but we still creep at horse and buggy pace toward gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter.
FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover.
There are clear and unmistakable signs that we are in the midst of a social revolution, with the racial movement at its core.
Malcolm X's influence over large numbers of American blacks first came through his leadership within Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam movement. Alex Haley, co-author of the autobiography of Malcolm X.
Malcolm X said that he had increased the Nation of Islam membership from about 400 when he had joined to around 40,000.
In 1957, Malcolm led over 100 Nation of Islam members to a Harlem police station where a Muslim who had tried to stop a police beating was being held. After the man was released and Malcolm arranged for medical treatment for the man's injuries from the police mistreatment, Malcolm dispersed his group. Police said,
No man should have that much power. Anyone who can turn off a riot can probably start one.
Geez, what about Martin Luther King? He had some power.
yes, Coretta Scott King.
After Birmingham, nearly 1,000 cities became engulfed in protests against segregation. This encouraged us to join in organizing a march on Washington to dramatize the need for new federal legislation to integrate blacks completely into American society. On August 28th, 1963, we participated in a mass rally with 250,000 people who had traveled from all over the country to Washington, D.C. Martin delivered his speech, "I Have a Dream," from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial.
Malcolm X responded to the March on Washington by saying,
They controlled it so tight, they told those Negroes what time to hit town, how to come, where to stop, what signs to carry, what song to sing, what speech they should make, and what speech they couldn't make, and then told them to get out of town by sundown, and every one of those Toms was out of town by sundown.
Here's J. Edgar Hoover again.
We wouldn't have any problems if we could get those two guys fighting. If we could get them to kill one another off.
No way. He said that?
Somehow, we must be able to stand up before our most bitter opponents and say, we shall match your capacity to inflict suffering by our capacity to endure suffering. We will meet your physical force with soul force. Do to us what you will, and we will still love you.
You don't have to have a turn-the-other-cheek revolution any time a shepherd, a pastor, teaches you and me not to run from the white man and at the same time teaches us not to fight the white man. He's a traitor to you and me.
Elijah Muhammad's Muslim movement is one of bitterness and hatred, and it comes perilously close to advocating violence. It is made up of people who have concluded that the white man is an incorrigible devil.
Be peaceful, be courteous, obey the law, respect everyone, but if someone puts his hand on you, send him to the cemetery. That's the old-time religion, an eye for an eye.
That old law of an eye for an eye leaves everyone blind.
The FBI had done surveillance on black leaders, almost since it began in the 1920s. But under Hoover in the 1950s and the 60s, black leaders were targeted under a program called COINTELPRO. That's an acronym for Counterintelligence Program. Here's Hoover from an FBI memo.
For maximum effectiveness of the Counterintelligence Program's Racial Intelligence Division, long-range goals are 1. Prevent the coalition of militant black nationalist groups. 2. Prevent militant black nationalist groups and leaders from gaining respectability by discrediting them.
They did surveillance, burglary, blackmail, trying to infiltrate, trying to discredit and disrupt domestic political organizations.
And 3, prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the militant black nationalist movement.
And Malcolm was just that person. From an FBI memo written by the special agent in charge of the FBI's Chicago office.
Over the years, considerable thought has been given and action taken with Bureau's approval relating to methods through which the Nation of Islam could be discredited in the eyes of the general black populace, or through which factionalism among the leadership could be created, the most notable being with Malcolm X.
They tried to drive a wedge between Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, led by Elijah Muhammad, and it worked. On March 8, 1964, Malcolm X announced his departure from the Nation of Islam, saying it had gone as far as it could. He said he was prepared to cooperate in local civil rights actions in the South and elsewhere.
As of this minute, I've forgotten everything bad that the other leaders have said about me. And I pray they can also forget the many bad things I've said about them.
Right on.
Malcolm and Martin met for the first and only time in the nation's capital on March 26, 1964. They had both been listening to the Senate's debate on civil rights legislation. Afterwards, they spoke together and were interviewed.
If the Senate keeps on talking and doing nothing, the creative direct action program will start. If the Civil Rights Act is not passed, our nation is in for a dark night of social disruption.
I'm here to remind the white man of the alternative to Dr. King.
And they shook hands warmly.
That must have given Hoover the absolute willies.
It wasn't just the handshake that did that.
When you expand the civil rights struggle to the level of human rights, you can take Uncle Sam before a world court.
Malcolm wasn't neutralized. In fact, he was turning to the world stage now. He traveled extensively, and he met with most of the African leaders. Many of them received him just like a head of state. In a CIA memorandum, an informant stated that Malcolm X was
transporting material dealing with the ill treatment of the Negro in the United States. He intends to make such material available to the Organization for African Unity in an effort to embarrass the United States.
Here's Malcolm X speaking to African leaders at the Organization of African Unity meeting in Cairo in July 1964.
We stand defenseless at the mercy of American racists who murder us at will for no reason other than we are black and of African descent. It is not a problem of civil rights, but a problem of human rights. What makes our African brothers hesitate to bring the United States government before the United Nations and charge her with violating the human rights of 22 million African Americans?
As the New York Times reported here,
The African move profoundly disturbed the American authorities, who gave the impression that they had been caught off guard.
So the stakes got higher?
Malcolm X.
I was having dinner at the Nile Hilton in Cairo. I felt a pain in my stomach, and in a flash, I realized that I'd seen the waiter who served me before. At the hospital, the doctor said that there was a toxic substance in my food. When the Egyptians who were with me looked for the waiter who had served me, he'd vanished. I know that our Muslims don't have the resources to finance a worldwide spy network.
Malcolm's later travels abroad were tracked by practically the entire U.S. intelligence network. On February 4th, 1965, J. Edgar Hoover sent a memo to
CIA Director, CIA Deputy Director of Plans.
Who?
The CIA officer in charge of Cold War assassinations.
Army Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence, Director of Naval Intelligence, Chief of the Air Force Counterintelligence Division,
and officers in London and Paris whose names were so sensitive that they were deleted from the document.
He's got the CIA and the whole military against him now.
After every one of my trips abroad, America's rulers see me as being more and more dangerous. That's why I feel in my bones the plots to kill me have already been hatched to high places. The more I keep thinking about the things that have been happening lately, I think I'm going to quit saying it's the Muslims.
It wasn't just happening to Malcolm. Martin Luther King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
I feel as though this prize has been given to me for something that really has not yet been achieved. It is a commission to go out and work even harder for the things in which we believe.
But Hoover had a different point of view.
King was the last one in the world who should have received it.
Here's William Sullivan. He's the FBI head of intelligence.
Hoover told me that he felt that King was, or could become, a serious threat to the security of the country. He pointed out that King was an instrument of the Communist Party and that he wanted it proved that King had a relationship with the Soviet bloc.
In 1964, King told an audience in Jackson, Mississippi, that he was
Sick and tired of people saying this movement has been infiltrated by communists. There are as many communists in this freedom movement as there are Eskimos in Florida.
Later, in 1976, the FBI admitted that they had no evidence of King's involvement in communist organizations.
At the bottom, Hoover was concerned about King's repeated criticism of the FBI and its alleged lack of interest in the civil rights movement.
According to King, the FBI, under the direction of Hoover,
was following the path of appeasement of political powers in the South. If this continues, this reign of terror in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia will increase rather than subside.
Hoover went out after him with his biggest guns. Hoover instructed us that tapes made in King's hotel rooms were to be made available to some members of the press, to select congressmen, and to President Johnson. He even sent derogatory information about King to the Pope prior to the King's visit to Rome for a papal audience.
You're kidding.
Hoover wanted some excerpts of the tape sent to King's wife, Coretta. Enclosed in the box with the tape was an unsigned note to Dr. King.
The American public, the church organizations that have been helping, will know you for what you are. You are done. There's only one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation.
How could he do that? It's just so...
Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. came to have similar views against war and for economic justice, and each continued challenging the interests of those in power.
Things can't keep going on like this.
No, it's drawing to a close. On the evening he arrived in Memphis, the night before he was shot, King told a crowd of sanitation workers,
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land.
Kennedy had planned his trip to Dallas as part of a difficult re-election campaign. Dallas was a dangerous place, but Kennedy was undeterred. Speaking to his wife, Jackie Kennedy, on their way to Dallas,
Jackie, if somebody wants to shoot me from a window with a rifle, nobody can stop it, so why worry?
The morning of his assassination, Malcolm spoke on the phone with his sister Ella in Boston. His last words to her were,
You pray for me, Ella, because I firmly believe now I need it more than I've ever needed it before. So you ask Allah to guide me because I feel they may have me doomed for this day.
Not this day.
Yes, this day.
the morning of November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy arrived in Dallas, and he rode through the jubilant streets in his motorcade. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King, still preparing for the march in Memphis, went out on the balcony of the Lorraine Hotel dressed for dinner. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm arrived at the Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan. Here's Marika Matthews, an eyewitness.
Malcolm rose to the stage, and after a few moments of extended applause, began.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Our attention was distracted by the man sitting directly in front of us. He jumped to his feet and yelled, "Get your hand out of my pocket!" The accused guy gave him a dumbfounded look, and someone yelled out, "Hey, buddy, take it easy." Then confusion reigned.
Betty Shabazz, Malcolm's wife.
"My husband! They're killing my husband!"
Jackie Kennedy.
His last expression was so neat. He had his hand out. I could see a piece of his skull coming off, It was flesh-colored, not white. And I can see this perfectly clean piece detaching itself from his head.
Dr. Charles Crenshaw at the Parkland Hospital in Dallas, where the president was taken after he was shot.
Mrs. Kennedy, drying blood, caked the right side of her dress and down her leg, her once white gloves. Anger, disbelief, despair, and resignation were all present in her expression. If she hadn't been standing, I would have thought she was wounded.
Here are Dexter King and Betty Shabazz.
To me, it was just like it was yesterday. I mean, I remember what I was doing when he was killed. I remember details of everything.
No one believed what he said. They never took him seriously, even after the bombing of our home. They said he did it himself.
Yolanda King and Jackie Kennedy.
I was 12. I was 12 years old. For a long time, I pretended that he was just away. And because he was away a lot, it was easy to do that. I was an adult when I really mourned my father. I guess you never really get over it completely.
I was trying to hold his hair on, but from the front there was nothing. But from the back, you could see you were trying to hold his hair on and his skull on.
Fidel Castro at lunch with JFK's unofficial envoy.
This is bad news. This is bad news. Everything will change. Everything has changed.
Coretta Scott King.
He used to say that the end of life is not to be happy, but to do God's will, come what may.
Here's Malcolm's 6-year-old daughter, Atala.
Dear Daddy, I love you so. Oh dear, I wish you wasn't dead.
I think a lot of people are confused by the new Arabic name, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz.
I've always had the name on my passport, Malik El-Shabazz, only I only used it in the Muslim world. Well, Hajj is a title that is given to any Muslim who makes the pilgrimage to Mecca during the official Hajj season.
Well, will you now use Shabazz and drop X?
I'll probably continue to use Malcolm X and I'll probably use it as long as the situation that produced it exists.
You don't feel that Shabazz takes the place of X?
My going to Mecca and going into the Muslim world, into the African world, and being recognized and accepted as a Muslim and as a brother may solve the problem for me personally. But I personally feel that my personal problem is never solved as long as the problem is not solved for all of our people in this country. So I remain Malcolm X as long as there is a need to protest and struggle and fight against the injustices that our people are involved in this country.
Are you prepared to go into the United Nations at this point and ask that charges be brought against the United States for its treatment of American Negroes?
Oh, yes. Please.
I think you're right in my opinion.
The audience will have to be quiet. Yes, as I pointed out when I was during my traveling, that African nations and Asian nations and Latin American nations look very hypocritical when they stand up in the United Nations condemning the racist practices of South Africa and that which is practiced by Portugal and Angola, and saying nothing in the UN about the racist practices that are manifest every day against Negroes in this society. Even in South Africa, those Africans aren't faced with bayonets and aren't faced with police dogs. I would be not a man. If I was in a position to bring it in front of the United Nations and didn't do so, I wouldn't be a man.
Malcolm, do you intend to lead the charge in the United Nations?
Well, I find that to say you're going to lead something creates a lot of hostility, division, jealousy, and envy. I hope to work with any group of leaders or any group of organizations to do whatever is necessary to see that this problem is brought before the United Nations.
Have you had any commitments from any nations in Africa to support you in such a move?
I would rather not say at this time. But one thing I found in my travels, all of them look upon us as their long-lost brother.
You realize the implication is that you have had such commitments when you say...
This is your interpretation of what I said. One thing that I found in all of my travels was that all of the Africans, not only the Africans, but the Asians and the Muslims, look upon us as their long-lost brothers. And America had actually tricked many of them into a hands-off policy by giving them the impression that she was honestly trying to do something to solve the problem. My argument over there was designed to prove that it is impossible for the United States government to solve the race problem. It's impossible.
Malcolm, on your trip abroad, you said you sensed a feeling of great brotherhood, and that conceivably you would be working toward integration in this country now. At least this is what you're reported to have said. Have you any comment on it?
I don't think that I ever mentioned anything about working toward integration. They haven't even got integration right here in New York City. You have worse integration problems in the North than they have in the South. So if it doesn't work if you can't bring about integration in New York City as international, cosmopolitan, up-to-date as it's supposed to be, you will never get integration anywhere else in the country.
Are you prepared to work with some of the leaders of the other civil rights organizations?
Certainly, certainly. We will work with any groups, organizations, or leaders in any way, as long as it's genuinely designed to get results.
Does your new beard have any religious significance?
No, not particularly, but I do think that you'll find black people in America, as they strive to throw off the shackles of mental colonialism, will also probably reflect an effort to throw off the shackles of cultural colonialism. And they may begin to reflect desires of their own, with standards of their own.
Malcolm, your more controversial remarks was a call for black people to get rifles and form rifle clubs sometime back. Do you still favor that for self-defense?
I don't see why that should be controversial. I think that if white people found themselves the victim of the same kind of brutality that black people in this country face, and they saw that the government was either unwilling or unable to protect them, that the intelligence on the part of the whites would make them get some rifles and shotguns and protect themselves. Now, Negroes are developing some kind of intellectual maturity too, and they can see that having waited upon the government to protect them has been a wait that has been in vain. So any of them who live in areas where the government is not able to do its job, then we do have to get together and do a job of protecting ourselves.
Do you feel that your message, apparent message of love that you brought back from Islam is the real reason they're after you, because you're not hating as hard as they want you to?
Well, I never did hate anybody hard, but I do know that when I wrote that letter saying that there were white people in Mecca, it shook up a lot of Muslims, because most of the Muslims who follow Mr. Muhammad absolutely believed that it was impossible, physically impossible, I should say divinely impossible, for a white person to go to Mecca. And my trip there shattered that image, or that misconcept.
Anyone call you directly, Malcolm?
I've been receiving calls ever since I left the Black Muslim movement.
And what sort of calls, Malcolm? You're disenchanted in view of the fact that these men who were your brothers are making threats against your life?
No, because actually it's not their fault. Most of them, now Joseph and the officials, they have a knowledge of what it's all about. But the rank-and-file Muslim brother does not know what it's all about. They are, out of religious sincerity, they think that they are doing the will of Allah by protecting a man who I myself taught them was divine. So I don't in any way fault them. But those who are over them and give the orders, and actually the ultimate order comes from Elijah Muhammad himself. As long as I represented the Black Muslim movement as an example of morality, unity, and militancy, as long as I could do that, I represented it. It was when I realized that it could not be represented as that I came on and started working among the non-Muslim Negroes, as I announced in January, and I had no intention, or rather March, and I had no intention of ever even speaking on this. Had they left me alone, you still wouldn't know what really took place.
Why are they threatening your life?
Well, primarily because they're afraid that I will tell the real reason that I'm out of the black Muslim movement, which I never told. I kept to myself. And I had stated in a newspaper article about an effort to take my life back in January, and at that time the Muslims denied it. In fact, they tried to make it appear to my brother that I was insane. But on a program in Chicago called Hotline, that's moderated by Wesley South, John Ali, the national secretary, admitted, I think it was Wednesday or Thursday, one of these days last week, that they absolutely were going to kill me.
What steps will you take to protect yourself from this threat?
I take no steps. I have a rifle. If anybody comes to my house without a good reason, I intend to try and use it. No, I don't worry. I tell you, I'm a man who believed that I died 20 years ago. And I live like a man who is dead already. I have no fear whatsoever of anybody or anything.
My friends, here we are again. I feel like I'm a pebble, hard and round, small. I've been dropped in a well, and the well is deep. I just keep falling. There is no bottom. The grief is deep, and I am drowning. Then I panic. I puff up with lies and thrash to the surface. I just want to wake up. You know what I mean?
Robert Kennedy served as Attorney General in his brother JFK's administration, and then became a U.S. Senator for New York in 1965. Then, in early 1968,
I am today announcing my candidacy for the presidency of the United States. I run to seek new policies to end the bloodshed in Vietnam and in our cities, policies to close the gaps that now exist between black and white, rich and poor, young and old in this country and around the rest of the world. I run because it is now unmistakably clear that we can change these disastrous, divisive policies only by changing the men who make them.
and he had few friends within the upper reaches of the FBI and the CIA. They remembered his role in supporting his brother's policies. At an FBI meeting held when RFK's campaign began, Hoover's assistant, Clyde Tolson,
I hope that someone shoots and kills the son of a bitch.
Bobby Kennedy told journalist Pete Hamill,
I have to decide whether to eliminate the operations arm of the CIA or what the hell to do with it. We can't have these cowboys wandering around and shooting people and doing all these unauthorized things.
Jesus, here we go again. But there were investigations, right?
Right. Lone nuts or black brothers killed them all. No involvement from anyone else. No conspiracies. Just one example for today. JFK's official story from the official report.
The shots which killed President Kennedy were fired from the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. The Commission has found no evidence of any conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy.
The Texas School Book Depository was behind the presidential motorcade. If the official story were true, the bullets would have entered President Kennedy from the back. Dr. Charles Crenshaw was on duty at the Parkland Hospital where the president was first taken.
I noticed a small opening in the midline of his throat, a bullet entry wound. There was no doubt in my mind about that wound, as I've seen dozens of them in the emergency room.
21 out of 22 witnesses at Parkland Hospital, most of them doctors and nurses, trained medical observers, agreed in their earliest statements that JFK's massive head wound was located in the right rear of his skull, demonstrating a fatal headshot from the front.
What about Robert Kennedy? Did he buy the official report?
He supported it in public at first, but in 2013, his son, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., said,
In private, he was dismissive of it. My father believed the report was a shoddy piece of craftsmanship.
Adrienne Rich, poet and feminist.
Whatever is unnamed, whatever is misnamed as something else, whatever is buried under an inadequate or lying language, this will become not merely unspoken, but unspeakable.
Robert Kennedy had won 6 Democratic primaries before winning the California vote on June 4, 1968. He made a victory speech for supporters at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles after the announcement of his win. Here's Nina Rhodes, an eyewitness at the hotel.
As he finished his speech, I went to greet him, and this tall, blond man in a tuxedo whisked him in the other direction. So they're heading toward the kitchen. I said, no, you're going the wrong way. And then people are falling, sliding down the wall, ducking. Then I look down and I see the senator has fallen, and I'm screaming, oh my God, no, oh my God, no. It was like, not again, not again. Not only was it a heartbreaking experience, all my hopes were dashed about what he could do for the country.
Who shot him?
The official story? Sirhan, a Palestinian-born Jordanian, was convicted of the crime.
Another lone nut, I suppose?
Here's Paul Schrade, Robert Kennedy's close associate, who was also shot.
You don't need anything but the clear-cut evidence to prove that Sirhan wasn't a lone gunman, as the LAPD contends.
As The Guardian reported on February 22, 2008, acoustic forensic expert Philip Van Prague concluded,
It is possible to make out 13 shots. That is more than the 8 rounds that Sirhan's revolver carried. Also, there are 2 pairs of double shots that occurred in so close together, it is inconceivable that Sirhan could have fired them all.
So 13 shots from a gun that could only fire 8.
And then there's the issue of the distance between the gun and the wounds. Autopsy evidence showed that all 4 bullets that entered Robert Kennedy's body were fired at a distance no greater than 6 inches, and that the fatal shot to the head was fired at a distance of no greater than 2 inches. Yet all the eyewitness testimony puts Sirhan's gun muzzle at a range of from 1.5 to 3 feet from Kennedy.
There are lots of issues with the official stories, but for today, just one more example. Let's look at the autopsy of President Kennedy. Remember how Dr. Crenshaw thought the shot in the neck was the entrance wound?
Yes.
Well, just after the assassination, the Secret Service took control of the body, but Dallas coroner Earl Rose resisted them, saying Texas law and the chain of evidence required him to perform an autopsy before the body left the Parkland Hospital in Dallas. The Secret Service pushed ahead with the coffin. Earl Rose stood aside.
The president's body was flown from Dallas to the Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. On the afternoon of the assassination, Dr. Robert B. Livingston, scientific director for 2 of the National Institutes of Health, placed a call to the head of the autopsy team at Bethesda Naval Hospital. Dr. Humes.
I said that if the wound were confirmed as a wound of entrance from the front of the president, that there had to have been more than one gunman. At just that moment, there was an interruption in our conversation. Dr. Humes returned after a pause to say, "Dr. Livingston, I'm sorry, but I can't talk with you any longer. The FBI won't let me."
Lieutenant Colonel Pierre Fink was the Army doctor who assisted Dr. Humes in the autopsy. Colonel Fink was questioned under oath about the president's autopsy.
Was Dr. Humes running the show?
Well, I heard Dr. Humes say, "Who's in charge here?" And I heard an Army general, I don't remember his name, stating, "I am."
How many other military personnel were present in the autopsy room?
The room was crowded with military and civilian personnel and federal agents and Secret Service agents and FBI agents.
Navy medical corpsman Paul O'Connor was also in the autopsy room.
It got very tense. Admiral Galloway started getting very agitated about the wound in his neck. I remember the doctors were going to check that out when Admiral Galloway told them, "Leave it alone, don't touch it, it's just a tracheotomy." He stopped anybody from going further. Doctors Humes and Boswell, Dr. Fink, were told to leave it alone.
After several questions related to the track of the bullet in President Kennedy's neck, Dr. Fink continued his testimony.
I will ask you the question one more time. Why did you not dissect the track of the bullet wound that you have described today and you saw at the time of the autopsy, at the time you examined the body?
As I recall, I was told not to, but I don't remember by whom.
James Jenkins, who also assisted in the autopsy, confirmed that the doctors were obeying military orders.
In retrospect, I think doing the autopsy in Bethesda rather than at Parkland Hospital in Dallas was a controlling factor. They could control Humes, Boswell, and Fink because they were in the military. And if we weren't controlled, we could be punished. And that kept us away from the public.
Charles Crenshaw, Parkland Hospital doctor.
There was a conspiracy of silence. I believe there was a common denominator in our silence, a fearful perception that to come forward with what we believed to be the medical truth would be asking for trouble. Although we never admitted it to one another, we realized that the inertia of the established story was so powerful, so thoroughly presented, so adamantly accepted, that it would bury anyone who stood in its path. I was as afraid of the men in suits as I was of the men who had assassinated the president. I reasoned that anyone who would go so far as to eliminate the President of the United States would surely not hesitate to kill a doctor.
Police and security forces were pulled back from their protective duties for all four leaders. The evidence and the investigations were mishandled in all four cases. The police and others did more than that. Take the case of Martin Luther King and the testimony of Lloyd Jowers, the owner of the restaurant across the street from where King was shot.
Jowers was a former Memphis police officer who had a relationship with Frank Liberto, who Jowers described as a mafia operative. From an ABC News Primetime Live December 1993 interview with Sam Donaldson.
Were you involved in the conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King Jr.?
I was involved in it indirectly. Liberto had done me a large favor. I owed him a favor.
What did Frank Liberto ask you to do?
He asked me to handle some money transactions, or a money transaction, hire someone to assassinate Dr. Martin Luther King.
Kill Dr. King?
Yes, sir. He asked me if I know someone. I told him I thought I knew someone who would probably do it.
Did he talk about the police?
Liberto? Yes, sir. He said they wouldn't be there. Said they wouldn't be there that night.
Did he say there would be a decoy there?
Yes, sir. Said he had set it up where he looked like somebody else did the killing.
Enter James Earl Ray. Was he part of the conspiracy?
He was part of it, but I don't believe he knew he was part of it.
Well, Mr. Jowers, did you find someone to do the killing?
Yes, sir.
That was on TV.
But that's not all Jowers said about King's assassination. In interviews with Louis Garrison, his attorney, Jowers confirmed that planning sessions for the assassination were held in his bar and grill across the street from the Lorraine Hotel. Those meetings included at least 2 Memphis Police Department officials and 1 or 2 men Jowers thought were CIA or FBI. They also included Morrell McCullough.
Here's William Pepper, who investigated McCullough.
Merrill McCullough had been in the regular army up to December 1966. Then in June 1967, he was reactivated and hired as a military intelligence informant.
Reporter Mark Peruskia.
The FBI arranged McCullough's placement in the Memphis Police Department's intelligence squad.
Wait, this guy was military intelligence assigned to the local police, but the FBI put him there?
And in 1974, where do you think McCullough got his next job?
You're not going to tell me the CIA.
Exactly. But testifying before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, here's what McCullough said.
At any time through the period of the assassination, did you have any relationship with the FBI?
Oh, no, sir. I was solely responsible to the police department.
Did you have any relationship with any other intelligence agency?
No, sir.
At the time of King's assassination, his is the figure seen bending over King's body.
My friends, I'm trapped in a maze of untruths and half-truths, hidden truths, deleted truths, denied truths, and truths repaid by death, suspicious deaths, designer deaths, by poison, by shooting, by electrocution, in public, in private. To dare to speak the truth means to invite assassination. So I put my head down. I doubt. I water the plants and pay the bills. Drink the Kool-Aid complicity, the medicine of slaves. I say, how can I be sure? I don't have the time. There's nothing I can do. I follow directions, keep between the lines. I stop at the corners, teach my children to cooperate. I call it a privilege to take up the tokens on a cold, dark road that leads nowhere. My friends, one word could bring down these lies. One word spoken freely in public. One word that is the truth. One word I bury in the boneyard of the unspeakable.
President John F. Kennedy.
The great enemy of the truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic.
William Schaff, lawyer, author, and journalist, testifying under oath with William Pepper.
Disinformation is very, very effective over time. The longer that you can control the spin on a story, the more that spin becomes accepted as the absolute truth. And in this country, the government has a great deal of power and influence over that spin.
Can you give us some idea of the influence that the CIA and the FBI have had over the media?
The Church Committee.
That's the Senate committee that looked into illegal intelligence gathering activities in 1975.
The Church Committee reported that the CIA had thousands of journalists in their employ. They also owned outright the CIA about 250 more media organizations, wire services, newspapers, magazines, radio, TV stations. The actual shareholder of the company turned out to be a CIA front.
Incredible.
Former New York Congressman Alec Lowenstein, a civil rights advocate who had pushed to reopen the Sirhan investigation.
It seems fair to say that there is now a rebuttal presumption that more than one assassin was involved in the RFK case. But what is even clearer is that nobody is making a serious effort to rebut that presumption. The notion seems to be that the presumption can be waited out, that unanswered questions will fade given time, and that the best way to deal with awkward new facts is to ignore them until they can be denounced as nothing new and then dismissed.
Martin Schatz, psychiatrist and author.
This is what we mean by mass denial. The murder of the president is not a mystery. Any citizen who is willing to look can see clearly who killed President Kennedy and why.
So, what agency, what power carried out the Kennedy assassination?
Colonel Fletcher Prouty, former head of Special Operations.
No agency played a role as an agency. I've worked on assassinations in other countries, or the removal from office of people from other countries. We called it the Gold Key Club. A certain small group coalesces, and they're given an order to do something. For example, there was a program called Mongoose, whose objective was to remove Castro from office in Cuba. The people assigned to Mongoose were from various agencies in various countries, working together. Some others who were not from any agencies, they were hired employees from other specialties and other businesses that are competent in this business of establishing coups d'etats and things like that.
Coup d'etat?
Gaten Fonzie is a former federal investigator for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. In his book, The Last Investigation, Fonzie names those who he was convinced were involved.
A cabal of associates whose careers were entwined with the history of CIA assassination plots.
The unspeakable.
Jim Douglas speaking.
The unspeakable is not far away. It is not somewhere out there. We U.S. citizens supported our government when it protected our Cold War security by world-destructive weapons, and when it carried out the covert murders of foreign leaders with plausible deniability. By avoiding our responsibility for the escalating crimes of state done for our security, we who failed to confront the unspeakable opened the door to JFK's assassination and its cover-up. The unspeakable is not far away.
Here's researcher Martin Schatz.
One of the primary means of immobilizing the American people politically today is to hold them in a state of confusion, in which anything can be believed, but nothing can be known. And the American people are more than willing to be held in this state, because to know the truth is to face an awful terror and to be no longer able to evade responsibility. It is precisely in moving from belief to knowledge that the citizen moves from irresponsibility to responsibility, from helplessness and hopelessness to action.
Here's David Grossman, author.
Better to hand over the job of thinking and doing and setting moral standards to those who are surely in the know. Better not to feel too much until the crisis ends, and if it never ends, at least we'll have suffered a little less, developed a useful dullness, protected ourselves as much as we could with a little indifference, a little repression, a little deliberate blindness, and a large dose of self as anesthetics.
And author James Baldwin.
Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced.
In 1990, over 30 years after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the King family initiated a wrongful death lawsuit against Lloyd Jowers and other unknown co-conspirators.
What was the verdict?
Here's the judge reading the jury's unanimous findings.
In answer to the question, did Lloyd Jowers participate in a conspiracy to do harm to Dr. Martin Luther King? Your answer is yes. Do you also find that others, including governmental agencies, were parties to this conspiracy as alleged by the defendant? Your answer to that one is also yes.
Here's Dexter King.
The question now is, what will you do with that?
Hey, that's from my dream.
Certainly, in death, my father can be martyred and put on a pedestal, but does America really want to deal with what he was fighting for? It is not about who killed Martin Luther King Jr. It is about why he was killed. Because if you answer the why, you will understand the same things are still happening. Until we address that, we're all in trouble.
And again, here's President Carter.
America does not, at the moment, have a functioning democracy.
He really said that?
Just 2 years ago.
And in really large campaigns, there are often only a handful of people who are the connectors. Without them, communication, coalition, coordination, and solidarity will break down. With the NSA spying program, they can easily see who the bridge people are and who they need to target. Sound paranoid? Or are we at a point where nothing sounds paranoid anymore?
Maybe I am paranoid, or at least afraid. As that doctor said, if they can kill the president, they could certainly kill me.
Again, here's Thomas Merton.
One of the awful facts of our age is the evidence that the world is stricken to the very core of its being by the presence of the unspeakable.
So?
What?
What are you thinking?
Nothing. I'm just wondering what those 4 men would have said about all this.
Today, there is a danger that illusion may prevent effective action.
I know that societies have often killed the people who have helped to change those societies.
A man who won't die for something is not fit to live.
There is a Chinese curse which says, "May he live in interesting times." Like it or not, we live in interesting times. They are times of danger and uncertainty, and they are also more open to creative energy.
I am reminded of James Baldwin and the poet-activist Audre Lorde.
The act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. Without the joyful acceptance of this danger, there can never be any safety for anyone, ever, anywhere.
When we speak, we are afraid. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it's better to speak.
You know what's surprising?
What's that?
That all this isn't so surprising. And whatever I'm feeling, it's better than feeling nothing.
And why is that?
It feels like a step forward. I'm glad you're here. I'm old enough to die a good death. May we have the courage to live a good life.